Welcome back to the Sleepy Mind channel. Tonight we will spend some time with you, Sagittarius. We will move through your qualities in the same steady way that patterns move through the night sky. This movement is slow, predictable, and free from effort. If you find these zodiac sleep stories useful, you are welcome to like the video and subscribe for more. You can also explore our other videos, each created to help you fall asleep in a calm and unhurried way. If you choose to leave a comment about where you are listening from, it is always interesting to see how far these stories travel. Many listeners find it grounding to notice this quiet sense of connection. Now we begin with you, Sagittarius. This time is simply for you. You've probably been described as optimistic more times than you can count, usually by people who think that optimism is a personality trait rather than a way of staying oriented. What they're noticing isn't cheerfulness so much as momentum. You tend to look forward instinctively, not because you're avoiding what's here, but because what's here rarely feels like the whole picture. Your attention leans ahead of the moment almost without effort. While something is happening, you're already sensing where it might lead, what it connects to, what it opens up next. This doesn't mean you're impatient. It means you experience life as a series of unfolding paths rather than isolated scenes. You're rarely interested in standing still inside a situation once you understand its limits. Staying put after something has revealed its shape can feel oddly suffocating, like rereading the same page once you already know how it ends. Movement for you isn't restlessness, it's orientation. This is why you don't always linger where others might. You're not dismissing what's in front of you. You're registering it, taking what it offers, and noticing when there's nothing new left to discover there. At that point, staying feels less like commitment and more like inertia. You tend to trust this internal sense of when something is complete, not finished in a neat way, but finished enough to stop asking for your attention. When that happens, your focus shifts naturally, without much internal debate. People sometimes read this as avoidance. From the inside, it feels more like accuracy. There's also a certain ease in how you move between ideas, places, and conversations. You don't need long transitions. Curiosity carries you across gaps that others feel the need to explain. One thought leads to another. One experience opens the door to the next. The connections make sense to you, even if you don't always articulate them out loud. This can make you seem scattered to people who prefer linear paths. What they miss is the through line you're following. You're not bouncing randomly. You're tracking meaning across a wider field. You're also more comfortable than most with not knowing exactly where something will lead. Certainty isn't what motivates you. Interest does. As long as something continues to offer perspective, insight, or expansion, you stay engaged with it. When it stops doing that, your attention loosens. That loosening doesn't come with much drama. There's no internal crisis. You simply notice that the pull is gone. You might recognize that this is why you're less attached to outcomes than people expect. Outcomes matter, but they're rarely the point. What matters more is what you learn along the way, how your view shifts, how your understanding widens. This is also why heavy seriousness can drain you quickly. Not because you lack depth, but because seriousness without movement feels static. You want ideas to breathe. You want conversations to go somewhere. You want life to keep opening rather than closing. You're not opposed to commitment. You just want it to feel like a choice that expands rather than a structure that narrows. When something aligns with that, you can stay with it far longer than people assume. And so you tend to move through the world with this forward-leaning curiosity, letting experience teach you as you go, trusting that what matters will stay interesting long enough to earn your attention, and that what doesn't will release you without needing to be forced. Your relationship with freedom is often misunderstood as well. People hear the word and imagine distance, detachment, or an allergy to responsibility. What they don't always see is how specific your sense of freedom actually is. You're not trying to escape obligation so much as you're trying to keep space for perspective. You need room to see the horizon, even when you're standing firmly in one place. This is why you tend to feel most yourself when there's a sense of openness somewhere nearby. Not necessarily physical space, though that can help, but mental space. A conversation that can wander, a plan that can adjust, a role that allows growth rather than locking you into a single version of yourself. When those conditions exist, you relax into whatever you're doing without feeling trapped by it. You've probably noticed that when that space disappears, your energy changes quickly. It's not panic or rebellion. It's more like a subtle tightening, as if your attention is being asked to collapse into something smaller than it needs to be. You start looking for exits, not because you want to leave immediately, but because you need to know they're there. You're also aware that this forward-facing orientation makes you good at reframing situations. You can usually find a way to see something as part of a larger story, rather than a dead end. Setbacks feel temporary when you can place them in a wider context. Difficult moments make more sense when they're framed as transitions rather than failures. This doesn't mean you ignore disappointment. You feel it. You just don't tend to sit inside it for very long without wondering what it's connected to, or what it quietly changes about the path ahead. You've probably noticed that you're drawn to ideas, people, and experiences that expand your understanding rather than confirm what you already know. Agreement is comfortable, but it rarely holds your interest for long. You're more engaged when something challenges your assumptions gently enough to be explored rather than defended. This can make you seem contradictory at times. You'll commit to an idea, then revise it later without much fuss. From the outside, it can look like inconsistency. From the inside, it feels closer to adjustment. New information arrives, and the shape of things shifts with it. There's also a natural humor in the way you encounter the world. You notice irony quickly. Contradictions amuse you more than they frustrate you. When things take themselves too seriously, you tend to tilt your head slightly and look for the angle that lets them breathe again. Laughter, for you, isn't dismissal. It's a way of keeping perspective intact. You're not especially drawn to certainty for its own sake. Certainty closes doors. You prefer ideas that can travel, that can be tested in different places and contexts without losing their shape. Beliefs that can move with you, rather than anchoring you in one spot. This is why you're often more interested in how something unfolds than in where it ends. What matters is what becomes visible along the way, what shifts, what opens, and whether the movement continues to offer something worth staying with. And you keep moving in that way, guided less by fixed endpoints and more by what continues to widen your view, letting curiosity do the orienting rather than insisting on a destination too early. You also tend to notice how quickly enthusiasm can change the atmosphere of a situation, including your own. When something catches your interest, there's an immediate lift, a sense that things have become more navigable simply because there's something to move toward. Energy gathers without being summoned, and effort feels lighter than it did a moment before. This is one of the reasons boredom weighs on you more than difficulty. Difficulty still has shape. It presents a problem, a puzzle, a stretch of road that might lead somewhere else. Boredom feels closed, like a room with no windows. You don't panic in it, but you don't stay long either. You're often drawn to conversations that feel slightly unfinished, the kind that leave space for another question, rather than sealing themselves with a conclusion. Once everything is wrapped up too neatly, your attention begins to drift, not out of disrespect, but because there's nothing left for it to do. This drifting doesn't feel careless to you. It feels responsive. You follow what's alive and let the rest settle on its own. Staying engaged with something that has stopped offering movement feels more exhausting than moving on. You've probably noticed that you're more patient with people than you are with ideas. People can surprise you. They change pace, shift perspective, reveal something unexpected. Ideas that don't evolve tend to lose your interest much faster. You don't need constant novelty, despite what people sometimes assume. You need progression. Familiar ground explored from a new angle works just as well as something entirely new. What matters is that there's room to move inside it. There's also a particular way you relate to optimism that doesn't always match how it's described. You're not ignoring what's difficult. You're scanning for what's possible alongside it. Holding both at once feels natural to you, even when others treat them as opposites. This can make you sound hopeful, even when you're being realistic. You're not sugarcoating things. You're just leaving space for the story to continue beyond the current chapter. You've likely noticed that you don't feel especially attached to being right. Correctness matters, but only as a temporary position. Once something stops fitting, you adjust without much internal drama. Holding on out of pride feels heavier than letting go. This adjustment doesn't feel like loss. It feels like alignment shifting quietly into a better position. Something clicks. The view changes. You keep walking. You also tend to trust your ability to adapt more than your ability to predict. Plans are useful, but they're provisional. You're comfortable changing direction mid-stride if something better reveals itself just off to the side. This makes you less anxious about the future than people expect. You're not trying to map everything in advance. You're paying attention to what's unfolding and trusting yourself to respond when it does. You've probably noticed that this responsiveness works best when there's a sense of choice involved. Obligations that feel self-selected sit more easily with you than ones that feel imposed. When you choose something freely, you can commit to it with surprising consistency. It's the feeling of being boxed in that drains you, not the work itself. Remove the box, and the energy returns almost on its own. You also have a way of keeping things light without making them shallow. You notice when humor can loosen a moment that's starting to harden. A small shift in tone, a sideways observation, something that reframes without dismissing what's real. This doesn't mean you avoid seriousness. You just prefer it with airflow. You're often more comfortable in motion than at rest, but motion doesn't have to mean speed. It can be a slow walk, a long conversation, a gradual change of mind. As long as something is moving, you feel oriented. When things stall completely, that's when you start looking around, not in alarm, but in curiosity, as if asking where the next opening might be. And you continue like this, letting interest guide your attention, letting perspective widen as you go, staying engaged with what unfolds, rather than fixing your gaze on where it's supposed to end. You've probably noticed that learning feels different to you than it does to people who like to master things quickly and then move on. You don't collect facts just to have them. You keep them loose, letting them travel with you, waiting to see where they might become useful later. Something you heard in passing weeks ago suddenly fits a situation today, and it feels less like recall and more like recognition. This is why you're comfortable admitting when you don't know something yet. Not knowing feels temporary, not threatening. It leaves room for discovery. Pretending to know closes that space too early and makes everything feel smaller than it needs to be. You're often more interested in why something works than in whether it works. The mechanism matters. The pattern matters. Once you see how something holds together, you can usually adapt it to new contexts without much effort. Understanding travels better than rules. You've likely noticed that this makes you good at translating between worlds. Different cultures, different viewpoints, different ways of thinking. You don't feel the need to flatten them into sameness. You look for the thread that connects them, the shared question underneath the different answers. This doesn't mean you avoid taking a position. It means you arrive there through exploration rather than allegiance. Positions reached this way feel flexible, not fragile. They can shift without collapsing. You're also aware that your curiosity has a physical side to it. It's not just mental. There's a restlessness that shows up in the body when something feels too contained. A desire to stretch, to move, to change the scenery, just enough that new information can get in. This is why long periods of sameness can feel draining, even when nothing is wrong. It's not dissatisfaction, it's stagnation. You need variation the way some people need routine. At the same time, you don't enjoy chaos for its own sake. Too much change without direction scatters your attention. What works best is a sense of motion within a loose structure. Enough freedom to explore without losing your bearings entirely. You've probably noticed that when this balance is right, your mind becomes surprisingly calm. Thoughts line up rather than compete. Ideas connect instead of colliding. Energy flows without being forced. This is often when insight appears, not as a revelation, but as a quiet shift in how you see something familiar. A new angle makes an old situation feel different. Nothing external changes, but the internal landscape opens up. You don't tend to announce these moments. They're private, almost ordinary. Later, someone might notice that you've adjusted your approach or changed your mind, and they'll wonder when that happened. It happened while you were paying attention. You also tend to trust experience more than instruction. Advice can be useful, but it rarely settles things for you on its own. You want to test ideas in the real world, see how they behave when applied, how they hold up when conditions change. This makes you less attached to certainty and more attached to adaptability. Being able to revise feels safer than being sure. You've likely noticed that you feel most alive when you're in the middle of something that's still unfolding. Not knowing exactly how it will turn out gives your attention something to work with. Once everything is settled and labeled, your interest naturally loosens. This doesn't mean you avoid completion. It means you don't cling to it. Completion is just another phase, not a destination you need to linger at. You're comfortable leaving some things open-ended, trusting that what matters will circle back if it needs to. You don't chase meaning. You let it catch up with you as you move. And you keep moving in that way, guided by curiosity rather than certainty, letting understanding widen as you go, and staying responsive to whatever new perspective happens to come into view next. You've probably noticed that this openness changes how you relate to plans as well. You make them, you use them, and you abandon them without much guilt when they stop fitting the shape of what's actually happening. A plan to you is a working idea rather than a promise carved into stone. You're not careless with commitments. You just don't confuse commitment with rigidity. When a direction still makes sense, you stay with it. When new information arrives that changes the terrain, you adjust. Continuing out of loyalty to an outdated version of the situation feels stranger to you than changing course. This can make you seem unpredictable to people who equate reliability with sameness. What they don't see is the internal consistency you're following. You're loyal to what's real, not to what was once assumed. You've also noticed that you're more comfortable than most starting things without knowing exactly where they'll lead. Beginnings don't intimidate you. They energize you. The early stages are rich with information, full of possibility, before the shape of things hardens into routine. Routine itself isn't the problem. It's stagnation that wears you down. When routine still allows for discovery, you're fine with it. When it becomes repetitive without adding anything new, your attention starts to look for another opening. You tend to learn best by doing rather than by waiting until everything makes sense on paper. Movement clarifies. Experience answers questions that theory can't. You trust that understanding will catch up once you're already in motion. This trust gives you a kind of courage that doesn't always look like bravery from the outside. You don't leap blindly. You step forward knowing you can adjust mid-step. That flexibility makes the unknown feel workable rather than threatening. You've probably noticed that you don't enjoy being boxed into a single identity. Labels feel temporary to you, useful only for as long as they help you navigate. Once they start limiting how you see yourself or what you're allowed to explore, you quietly loosen your attachment to them. You're more interested in who you're becoming than in who you've been. Not because you reject the past, but because you see it as something you carry forward, not something you have to repeat. There's also a generosity in how you share what you learn. You don't hoard insight. When something makes sense to you, you enjoy passing it along, not as instruction, but as an invitation. A thought offered lightly, a perspective shared without insisting it be adopted. You've likely noticed that people often feel encouraged around you without knowing exactly why. It's not because you tell them what to do. It's because you remind them, quietly, that there are more options than the one they're currently staring at. This encouragement doesn't cost you much. It comes naturally from the way you see the world as expandable rather than fixed. When someone feels stuck, you instinctively look for the door that isn't obvious yet. You don't always point it out directly. Sometimes it's enough to stand near it and let them notice it themselves. You've probably noticed that this same quality applies inward as well. When you feel confined by a situation, you don't panic. You start scanning gently, looking for where movement might be possible. The search itself is calming. It reminds you that there's usually more than one way through. This is why you're not particularly afraid of change, even when it arrives unexpectedly. Change feels like an opening rather than a threat. It brings information. It offers new ground to explore. You don't rush into it blindly, but you don't resist it either. You meet it with curiosity, trusting that you'll find your footing as you go. And so you continue, moving through life with that forward-leaning ease, adjusting plans without apology, staying open to revision, and letting curiosity, rather than certainty, keep you oriented as the path continues to unfold. You've probably noticed that this way of staying open also affects how you experience setbacks. When something doesn't work out, Your first instinct isn't to replay it endlessly or ask what it says about you. You're more likely to look at what changed, what was revealed, and what that information makes possible next. Disappointment doesn't disappear for you, but it doesn't settle in the same way either. It passes through as something to be understood rather than something to be carried. Once it has shown you what it needed to show you, it loosens its grip. This is why you tend to recover your sense of momentum fairly quickly, not because you're dismissing what happened, but because you're already integrating it into a broader view. One closed door doesn't dominate the landscape when you're aware of how many paths are still open. You've likely noticed that you're more resilient when you allow yourself to keep moving mentally, even if nothing changes externally right away. Reframing isn't denial for you, it's orientation. It helps you place an experience where it belongs, so it doesn't crowd out everything else. You also tend to notice when a setback invites learning rather than correction. Some things don't need to be fixed, they need to be understood and left behind. Once you see which is which, the response becomes clearer. This can make you seem surprisingly calm in moments others treat as crises. You're not minimizing the difficulty. You're just seeing it as part of a longer arc, rather than a final statement. That perspective gives you room to breathe. You don't cling to what's already broken. You let it become part of the story, without insisting it define the whole thing. Carrying forward only what's useful feels lighter than dragging everything along. You've probably noticed that this approach helps you stay optimistic without forcing positivity. Optimism, for you, isn't a mood. It's a working assumption that things can still move. As long as movement is possible, you're willing to stay engaged. This doesn't mean you expect things to work out neatly. You expect them to keep unfolding. There's a difference, and it matters to you. You're comfortable trusting that unfolding, even when you can't see very far ahead. The unknown doesn't feel like a void. It feels like space. Space to explore, adjust, and respond as new information appears. And so you continue, meeting setbacks with curiosity rather than closure, letting experience widen your view instead of narrowing it, and staying oriented by the sense that the path remains open as long as you're willing to keep moving. You've probably noticed that this openness to movement also shapes how you relate to rest, even if you don't always call it that. Rest, for you, isn't about stopping completely. It's about releasing the pressure to arrive. When nothing is demanding a conclusion, your mind loosens its grip and settles into a quieter rhythm on its own. You tend to rest best when there's still a gentle sense of engagement nearby. A familiar voice. A story you already know the shape of. Something that gives your attention a place to land without asking it to perform. Total emptiness can feel oddly demanding, as if it's waiting for you to do something with it. You've likely noticed that when your attention isn't being pulled forward by curiosity or outward by obligation, it naturally starts to wander in smaller, slower loops. Thoughts drift, return, and drift again, not trying to solve anything, just moving lightly across whatever's present. This is when your thinking becomes less directional. Instead of looking ahead for what's next, it spreads out a little, touching memories, ideas, impressions, without attaching to any one of them for long. There's no urgency in this movement. It feels more like floating than searching. You don't need to force this state. It arrives on its own once effort drops away. Trying to make it happen usually tightens things again. You've learned, often without meaning to, that rest comes as a byproduct of allowing movement to slow naturally, rather than shutting it down. You may notice that in these moments, questions soften. They don't disappear, but they stop insisting on answers. They become background shapes instead of problems to solve. Your mind is still awake, just not busy. You're comfortable here in a way that might surprise people who assume you're always chasing the next thing. Chasing isn't what drives you. Interest does. When interest pauses, you pause with it, without feeling the need to replace it immediately. This is often when small realizations arrive quietly. Not insights that demand action, but gentle shifts in how you see something you already understood. Nothing changes outwardly, but the internal view opens a little more. You don't announce these shifts. You carry them forward and let them shape your next step when the time comes. And you continue in this way, letting movement and rest trade places without conflict, trusting that your attention knows when to explore and when to settle, and allowing both to happen without forcing either one into the foreground. You've probably noticed that your thinking feels most natural when it's allowed to roam a little. Not aimlessly, but without being funneled toward a single conclusion too quickly. Ideas open doors for you, and once a door is open, you're more interested in what's behind it than in whether you were supposed to go there in the first place. This is why rigid frameworks can feel oddly constraining, not because you dislike structure, but because fixed endpoints interrupt exploration. You prefer structures that move, that allow detours, that don't treat deviation as failure. A plan that can change direction mid-course feels more trustworthy to you than one that insists on being followed exactly. You tend to notice when conversations stop being curious and start being declarative. The moment everything is stated instead of questioned, your attention loosens slightly. It's not disagreement. It's the sense that nothing new is being invited in anymore. When curiosity is present, you stay. When it fades, you drift, often without making a conscious decision to do so. From the outside, this can look like restlessness. From the inside, it feels more like following the signal that says there's nothing else to learn here. You're comfortable letting that signal guide you, even when it means leaving something unfinished. Unfinished doesn't mean unresolved to you. It just means the exchange has given you what it had to offer. You've probably noticed that you don't experience curiosity as a distraction. It's more like an orientation system. When something catches your interest, it gives you a direction to move in, even if you don't yet know where that direction leads. Movement matters more to you than certainty. As long as there's a sense of exploration, you feel properly engaged with what's happening. This is why you tend to lose interest in situations that become overly final too quickly. Once everything is decided, labeled, and locked into place, there's not much left for you to do. The air goes still. The questions dry up. You don't experience that as satisfaction. You experience it as stagnation. You're not trying to escape responsibility when this happens. You're responding to the absence of possibility. Responsibility that still allows for growth feels fine to you. Responsibility that closes the door on curiosity feels heavier than it needs to be. You've probably noticed that you do your best thinking when you're allowed to move between ideas without being asked to justify the transitions. One thought leads to another, then another, not in a straight line, but in a way that still makes sense to you. The connections are there, even if you don't always spell them out. This can make your reasoning feel unconventional to people who prefer linear explanations. They want the steps numbered. You're already 3 ideas ahead, not because you skipped anything, but because you recognized where the thread was going before it was fully stated. You tend to learn through expansion rather than consolidation. Instead of narrowing something down until it fits neatly, you widen it until you can see how it relates to everything else. Understanding, for you, comes from context. Once you see the broader picture, the details fall into place on their own. This is why travel, in any form, has always appealed to you. Not just physical travel, though that has its place, but conceptual travel. New philosophies, different cultures, alternative ways of organizing life. You're drawn to anything that shifts your frame of reference, rather than reinforcing the one you already have. You've likely noticed that you don't cling tightly to beliefs. You hold them lightly, test them, move them around, see how they behave in different environments. When a belief stops working, you don't feel personally threatened by that. You replace it with something that fits better. From the outside, this can look like inconsistency. From the inside, it feels like honesty. You'd rather change your mind than defend something that no longer makes sense. You're also aware that this forward-leaning way of thinking gives you a natural sense of momentum. Even when things are uncertain, you rarely feel stuck for long. The unknown doesn't feel like a wall. It feels like open terrain. You may not know what's ahead, but you trust your ability to navigate once you're there. This trust changes how you relate to fear. Fear doesn't usually stop you. It slows you down just enough to look more carefully. Then you keep moving. Standing still indefinitely would feel far more uncomfortable than adjusting as you go. You've probably noticed that you're more tolerant of risk than of confinement. Risk implies possibility. Confinement implies limitation. As long as there's room to adapt, you're willing to engage with uncertainty. This is also why you don't enjoy being overmanaged. Excessive rules, rigid expectations, or environments that discourage questioning tend to drain you quickly. Not because you want to rebel, but because those conditions limit your ability to explore alternatives. You respond best to environments that trust you to figure things out. Given that freedom, you tend to be more responsible, not less. You pay attention. You adjust. You take ownership of your choices because they actually feel like choices. You've likely noticed that you're generous with perspective. When someone feels stuck, you instinctively look for the angle they haven't considered yet. Not to invalidate what they're feeling, but to show that the situation might not be as closed as it appears. You don't do this by offering advice so much as by widening the frame. A question asked at the right moment, a story that reframes the problem, a reminder that this isn't the only chapter in the book. Often, that's enough to shift how someone sees things. This same approach applies to how you handle your own setbacks. You don't dismiss them, but you rarely let them define the whole narrative. A problem becomes one data point rather than a final verdict. You look at what it teaches you, then you look ahead to where that information might be useful. You've probably noticed that this keeps your emotional life moving as well. Feelings pass through you rather than settling permanently. You experience them fully, but you don't fossilize them into identity. Who you are is always slightly larger than whatever you're feeling at the moment. This can make you seem resilient in ways people don't expect. Not because you're unaffected, but because you're not anchored to any single state for very long. Change feels normal to you. You adapt without needing to narrate the process. You're also aware that this adaptability can create a kind of restlessness when there's nothing to respond to. When life becomes too predictable, your attention starts searching for variation. Not excitement for its own sake, but something that reintroduces movement into the system. You don't chase chaos to get that movement. You look for expansion, a new idea, a different perspective, a challenge that asks you to think in a way you haven't had to before. When you find it, energy returns quickly. You've probably noticed that when something truly engages you, consistency is no longer a problem. You can stay with a project, a relationship, or a pursuit far longer than people expect, as long as it continues to offer growth. The stereotype of unreliability doesn't survive contact with genuine interest. What you don't tolerate well is obligation without meaning. Being asked to continue something simply because it's expected feels heavier than stopping altogether. You'd rather move forward honestly than remain out of habit. This is why your life tends to organize itself around questions rather than answers. Questions keep things alive. Answers settle them too quickly. As long as there's something left to explore, you're willing to stay engaged. And you keep moving in this way, not chasing certainty, not avoiding commitment, but following the pull of curiosity wherever it continues to open the view a little wider. You've probably noticed that your relationship with truth is less about certainty and more about range. You don't feel the need to pin things down the moment they make sense. Understanding, for you, works better when it has room to move. A truth that can only survive in one form doesn't interest you nearly as much as one that can be tested, questioned, and still hold together. This is why you're often drawn to philosophies rather than doctrines. Big ideas that stretch across cultures, histories, and belief systems feel more alive to you than tightly defined rules. You're not looking for something to obey. You're looking for something to explore, something that keeps opening rather than closing as you learn more about it. You tend to notice when people confuse conviction with depth. Strong opinions delivered confidently don't persuade you on their own. You listen for whether there's flexibility behind them, whether the belief can survive contact with new information without collapsing or hardening. Rigid certainty makes you uneasy. It feels like a stopping point rather than a place to stand. You're far more comfortable with ideas that admit they might change. That admission doesn't weaken them in your eyes. It strengthens them. It signals honesty, curiosity, and the willingness to keep learning, rather than defend a fixed position. This is also why you're less interested in being right than in being oriented. Being right can freeze a conversation. Being oriented keeps it moving. You'd rather adjust than entrench, revise than repeat, expand than defend. You've probably noticed that this makes you good at seeing the long arc of things. While others are focused on what's happening right now, you're already considering where it might lead, how it connects to what came before, and what it might make possible later. This doesn't mean you're ignoring the present. You're situating it. Situating gives you perspective. Perspective is one of the ways you stay grounded. When things feel intense or overwhelming, you instinctively zoom out. You place the moment inside a wider frame where it can be understood without swallowing everything else. This isn't avoidance, it's scale. You don't minimize difficulty when you do this. You contextualize it. A hard moment becomes one part of a larger movement rather than a permanent state. That shift alone often makes it easier to stay engaged without becoming trapped. You've likely noticed that this ability can make you a steady presence for others during uncertain times. You don't rush to reassure. You don't pretend everything will be fine. You simply remind them, sometimes without saying it directly, that this moment isn't the whole story. Often that's enough. You also tend to notice when people cling to explanations that no longer serve them. Stories they repeat about why something can't change, why they can't move, why this is how things have always been. You hear the story, but you're listening for the cracks in it, the places where it doesn't quite hold up anymore. You don't always challenge those stories head on. Sometimes you just ask a question that nudges the frame slightly. What happens if this isn't the end? What happens if this isn't the only option? What happens if this means something different than you thought? Those questions matter to you because they reopen movement. You've probably noticed that you feel most alive when there's a sense of expansion happening somewhere, even if it's subtle. Learning something new, seeing an old situation differently, realizing that a limit you assumed was fixed is actually negotiable. These moments energize you far more than praise or validation ever could. This doesn't mean you're chasing constant change. You don't need everything to be new. You need it to be alive. Familiar things can stay interesting if they continue to evolve. It's stagnation that drains you, not repetition itself. You're also aware that your optimism doesn't come from ignoring what's difficult. It comes from trusting that difficulty isn't final. You've seen too many situations shift unexpectedly to believe that the present moment has the last word. That trust changes how you respond when things don't go as planned. You don't collapse into disappointment. You don't harden into bitterness. You pause, reassess, and look for the next opening. Sometimes that opening appears quickly. Sometimes it takes longer. Either way, you remain oriented toward possibility rather than closure. You've likely noticed that this keeps your inner world relatively light, even when you're dealing with serious topics. You don't carry weight unnecessarily. You let experiences inform you, then you integrate what's useful and release the rest. This integration happens quietly. There's no ceremony around it. You don't announce that you've learned something. You just start moving differently. You also tend to notice that your curiosity applies inward as much as it does outward. When you react strongly to something, you don't just feel it. You wonder about it. Where did this come from? What does it connect to? What belief or expectation did it just brush up against? This curiosity doesn't distance you from your feelings. It gives them room to unfold without overwhelming you. Emotion becomes another landscape to explore rather than a force that takes over. You're comfortable with the idea that who you are is not finished, not in a vague self-help sense, but in a practical one. You expect yourself to change as you encounter new ideas, new environments, new versions of yourself that emerge under different conditions. Because of that, you don't cling tightly to identity. Labels feel provisional, useful for navigation, but not something you're obligated to defend. When a label stops fitting, you set it down without much fuss. This flexibility can make others feel unsettled, especially those who rely on fixed identities to feel secure. You don't see flexibility as instability. You see it as responsiveness. You've probably noticed that your sense of humor is tied to this as well. You see the irony in taking anything too seriously, including yourself. Not because nothing matters, but because rigidity tends to miss the point. A well-timed joke can open space where certainty had closed it. Humor, for you, is a way of keeping perspective intact. You're not especially interested in controlling where things go. You're interested in staying responsive as they go there. Control feels unnecessary when you trust your ability to adapt. That trust has been built slowly, through experience rather than theory. You've watched yourself land on your feet, often enough to believe you will again. You don't need guarantees to keep moving. You need curiosity, flexibility, and the sense that the path isn't finished yet. And so you continue in this forward-leaning way, not racing toward outcomes, not avoiding commitment, but letting interest, perspective, and the quiet promise of expansion guide your attention wherever it continues to open something new. You've probably noticed that this openness gives you a different relationship with risk as well. Risk doesn't automatically read as danger to you. It reads as information, something new entering the system, something that hasn't been mapped yet. You don't seek it recklessly, but you don't avoid it either. You weigh it against stagnation, and stagnation usually feels heavier. This is why safety, when defined too narrowly, can feel constricting. Predictability has its uses, but when it turns into a refusal to engage with uncertainty, your attention starts to thin. You don't need everything to be safe. You need it to be alive enough to respond to. You tend to trust yourself more in unfamiliar territory than in overly managed environments. When everything is controlled, there's little room to adjust. When things are open, you can read the terrain as you go. You notice what works, what doesn't, and you adapt in real time. That adaptability is something you rely on more than any set of instructions. You've likely noticed that this makes you less attached to guarantees. Guarantees freeze the future in a way that feels unnatural to you. You prefer possibilities that can evolve. Even when something is uncertain, it feels workable as long as there's space to respond. This shows up clearly in how you approach learning. You don't need mastery before you begin. You're willing to step into something half-known and let experience fill in the gaps. Mistakes don't discourage you much. They clarify. Each misstep tells you something about how the system actually behaves, not how it was supposed to behave. Because of this, you're often more comfortable being a beginner than people expect. Beginnerhood feels open. It gives you permission to ask questions, to try things out, to revise your understanding without embarrassment. Expertise that insists on being defended feels heavier than curiosity that's still moving. You've probably noticed that once something becomes overly formalized, your interest starts to loosen. Not because you dislike skill or depth, but because rigidity interrupts exploration. When rules replace responsiveness, you begin looking for another door. You also tend to notice when people mistake confidence for understanding. Confidence can be loud and still hollow. Understanding has a quieter quality. It shows up in how someone adjusts when something unexpected happens. You watch for that. This attentiveness makes you good at spotting potential. Not the vague motivational kind, but the practical kind. You see when a situation could become something else if approached differently. You notice when a person hasn't yet realized what they're capable of because they're stuck inside a narrow frame. You don't always point this out directly. Often, it's enough to ask a question that widens the frame slightly. What happens if this isn't the only option? What happens if this leads somewhere else? Those questions don't feel destabilizing to you. They feel orienting. You've likely noticed that you're less interested in conclusions than in trajectories. Where something is heading matters more than where it currently sits. A situation that's imperfect but evolving feels far more workable than one that's polished but closed. This can make you patient in situations others want to abandon quickly. As long as there's movement, you stay engaged. Once movement stops, patience drains quickly. no matter how comfortable things look on the surface. You also tend to notice that you don't carry guilt very well when it comes to change. When something stops fitting, you don't punish yourself for noticing. You adjust. Staying loyal to something that no longer reflects reality feels more dishonest than changing course. This can be difficult for people who rely on continuity to feel secure. You don't try to convince them otherwise. You simply move in the way that makes sense to you and let them decide whether they want to move alongside you. You've probably noticed that this gives your life a certain forward tilt. Even when you pause, the orientation remains. You're not standing still waiting for permission. You're watching for what's next, knowing it will reveal itself through engagement rather than planning. That orientation doesn't make you reckless, it makes you responsive. You're not chasing novelty, you're following signals. You also tend to be aware of when your curiosity is being misused. When someone presents complexity without substance or novelty without depth, you disengage quickly. Interest for you needs something to work with. Empty stimulation loses its pull fast. You prefer ideas that stretch over time, that reveal more the longer you stay with them. Shallow excitement fades too quickly to hold your attention. Depth that keeps unfolding, even slowly, feels far more satisfying. You've likely noticed that this applies to your inner life as well. You don't chase feelings for their intensity. You stay with the ones that teach you something. Once they've done that, they loosen on their own. You don't romanticize struggle, but you don't avoid it either. Difficulty that opens understanding feels worthwhile. Difficulty that goes nowhere does not. This is another reason you're not especially impressed by endurance for its own sake. Pushing through without learning feels pointless. Moving forward with awareness feels efficient. You've probably noticed that when things are aligned, effort feels minimal, even when you're doing a lot. When things aren't aligned, even small tasks feel draining. You trust that difference. It tells you something important about where your energy actually belongs. And so you keep moving in this way, attentive to signals rather than rules, willing to enter uncertainty when it offers growth, and ready to change direction when something stops opening the view ahead. You've probably noticed that this responsiveness also shapes how you relate to responsibility. You don't reject it, but you want it to make sense. Responsibility that feels connected to purpose sits easily with you. Responsibility that exists only because it's been assigned, inherited, or left unquestioned feels heavier than it needs to be. You tend to engage most fully when you understand why something matters. Once that connection is clear, you can be remarkably dependable. You show up consistently. You follow through. You stay engaged long after others have lost interest. What drains you isn't commitment itself, but commitment without meaning. This is why you sometimes resist being locked into roles too early. Not because you're unwilling to contribute, but because you want to see how the role actually functions before you give it your full energy. You pay attention to whether there's room to grow inside it, or whether it asks you to shrink in order to fit. You've likely noticed that when a role allows expansion, you can inhabit it with surprising steadiness. The stereotype of restlessness falls apart when you're given space to move within responsibility rather than around it. Freedom and commitment stop feeling like opposites. They start to work together. You also tend to notice when responsibility becomes performative, when effort is more about appearances than outcomes, when busyness replaces effectiveness. You disengage from that quickly, not out of laziness, but out of precision. Your energy is better used where it actually changes something. This precision extends to how you listen to authority as well. Titles and certainty don't impress you on their own. You're listening for whether someone understands the system they're operating in, whether they can adapt when conditions change, whether their confidence holds up under questioning. You're comfortable respecting authority that earns it through responsiveness rather than control. Authority that can't be questioned, that relies on repetition instead of clarity, tends to lose your attention. You've probably noticed that you learn a lot by watching how people handle uncertainty. Some tighten, some over-explain, some double down. You notice which responses lead to insight and which ones just create more noise. This makes you less afraid of uncertainty in yourself. Not knowing doesn't bother you as much as pretending to know. You trust that understanding will emerge if you stay engaged long enough. You also tend to notice that your sense of direction sharpens when you're allowed to revise along the way. Decisions that can be revisited feel safer than ones that demand finality too early. Flexibility doesn't weaken your commitment, it strengthens it. This is why you're often willing to take responsibility for outcomes without needing guarantees. You trust your ability to respond if things change. That trust reduces anxiety more effectively than certainty ever could. You've likely noticed that this gives you a natural tolerance for ambiguity in others as well. You don't demand that people have everything figured out. You're more interested in whether they're paying attention to what's actually happening. Effort paired with awareness earns far more respect from you than polished certainty. You're also aware that this way of moving can create friction with systems that value predictability above all else. Fixed timelines, rigid hierarchies, inflexible expectations can feel stifling. You're not trying to disrupt them. You're trying to find where movement is still possible inside them. Sometimes you succeed. Sometimes you realize the system isn't built for that kind of responsiveness. When that happens, you don't fight it endlessly. You look for a different environment where your way of engaging makes sense. You've probably noticed that this keeps your life in motion even when circumstances change. You don't cling to structures that no longer support growth. You adapt, not dramatically, but decisively. You also tend to notice that you're at your best when you feel trusted, not monitored, not managed, trusted to navigate uncertainty responsibly. When that trust is present, your energy organizes itself naturally. This doesn't mean you avoid accountability. You welcome it when it's real. Accountability that leads to learning, improvement, and clarity feels constructive. Accountability that exists only to enforce compliance feels hollow. You're often more interested in outcomes than optics. What actually changed? What moved? What improved? Performative success leaves you cold. Real progress, even if it's messy, holds your attention. You've probably noticed that when you're engaged this way, your sense of time shifts again. Not because you're rushing, but because you're absorbed. The future feels reachable without needing to be controlled. And so you continue forward, taking responsibility where it aligns with purpose, staying flexible where conditions require it, and trusting that meaningful commitment grows best in environments that allow movement rather than demand containment. You've probably noticed that this preference for movement over containment also shapes how you deal with expectations. Expectations that stay flexible feel workable. Expectations that harden into assumptions start to feel heavy very quickly. It's not the expectation itself that bothers you. It's the loss of room to respond intelligently when circumstances change. You tend to do well when expectations are treated as hypotheses rather than conclusions. Something to test, adjust, and refine, rather than something to satisfy at all costs. When that attitude is present, you're willing to put in sustained effort. When it isn't, your attention begins looking for ways to step sideways rather than forward. You're also aware that you don't like being managed through guilt. Obligation framed as moral pressure doesn't motivate you. It narrows your thinking and makes you resistant in a way that surprises people who assumed you'd comply out of goodwill. What works far better is clarity. What needs doing, why it matters, what happens if it doesn't. Given that information, you usually make a reasonable choice. This is one of the reasons you don't enjoy emotional manipulation, even subtle forms of it. When someone tries to pull you toward an outcome by amplifying urgency or invoking fear, your instinct is to slow down and reassess. You want to know whether the pressure is pointing to something real or just trying to rush you past your own judgment. You've probably noticed that you respond better to honesty than to persuasion. Being told the truth, even when it's inconvenient, gives you something to work with. Being nudged, coaxed, or steered without transparency makes you disengage. You don't experience this as distrust. It feels more like self-respect. You also tend to notice when people underestimate how much you're tracking. You may look relaxed, even amused, while you're quietly taking in far more than you let on. Tone shifts, small contradictions, changes in emphasis. You register these things without needing to comment on them. Later, when you respond in a way that reflects that information, people are sometimes surprised. They didn't realize you were paying attention at that level. You don't explain how you arrived there. The explanation wouldn't add much. You've likely noticed that this way of operating keeps you oriented even in unfamiliar environments. New places don't throw you off. You start scanning for how things work, rather than how they're supposed to work. You pick up cues quickly. Who decides? Who adapts? Who pretends not to notice what's obvious? This ability makes you adaptable without being slippery. You're not changing yourself to fit the situation. You're reading the situation accurately enough to decide how you want to engage with it. You also tend to trust yourself to learn as you go, rather than insisting on mastery before action. You don't need to feel fully prepared to begin. You need to feel curious enough to stay engaged once you do. That curiosity keeps you attentive long after initial enthusiasm fades. You've probably noticed that this gives you a certain tolerance for imperfection. Early mistakes don't discourage you much. They're part of the data. Each one tells you something about how the system responds. Over time, those small corrections add up to a clearer understanding than any upfront certainty ever could. This is why you don't always respect expertise that can't tolerate questions. If something is solid, it should survive being examined from multiple angles. When questioning is treated as disloyalty, your interest wanes quickly. You're far more engaged by people who are willing to say, "I don't know yet," and keep going anyway. That honesty creates movement. Pretended certainty stops it. You've also noticed that your curiosity isn't endless. It has standards. You don't chase novelty for its own sake. You stay with things that continue to reveal something new or useful. When repetition stops producing insight, you let go without resentment. This can make your life look episodic from the outside. Different chapters, different focuses, different directions. From the inside, it feels coherent. Each phase taught you what it had to teach. Staying longer wouldn't have added much. You're comfortable with that pacing. You don't measure progress by longevity alone. You measure it by how much understanding moved while you were there. This is why you don't fear change as much as people expect. Change is just another environment to read, another set of conditions to respond to. As long as you're paying attention, you trust that you'll find your footing. You've probably noticed that this trust makes you less anxious about the future. You're not trying to predict every turn. You're preparing to respond intelligently when the turn arrives. Those are very different things. And so you continue in this open-ended way, letting expectations remain flexible, responding to honesty rather than pressure, and staying engaged with whatever continues to offer room to move, learn, and adjust as the path unfolds. You've probably noticed that this openness also affects how you relate to certainty in yourself. You don't feel the need to arrive at a final answer before acting. Acting is often how the answer becomes clearer. Waiting for perfect clarity would mean never moving at all, and that has never felt natural to you. You tend to trust momentum more than resolution. As long as something continues to generate insight, you stay with it. When insight stops arriving, your attention loosens without needing to be persuaded. This isn't impatience, it's efficiency. You don't linger once something has said what it has to say. This is why you're often comfortable changing your mind publicly. Not because you enjoy contradiction, but because consistency without accuracy feels pointless. New information arrives, the internal picture shifts, and your position moves with it. Holding still just to appear reliable feels heavier than adapting honestly. You've probably noticed that this can unsettle people who rely on fixed positions to feel secure. They want commitments that don't change, answers that stay answered, opinions that don't evolve. You don't argue with that preference. You simply don't organize your life around it. Instead, you organize around responsiveness. Being able to adjust when reality changes matters more to you than preserving an earlier stance. You see flexibility as a form of intelligence, not weakness. You're also aware that this way of moving requires a certain tolerance for uncertainty. You don't always know what something will turn into, and you're fine with that. You're more interested in staying engaged with the process than in locking down the result prematurely. This is one of the reasons you tend to enjoy beginnings. Not because you dislike commitment, but because beginnings are information dense. Everything is still visible. Nothing has hardened yet. You're paying attention to what's possible before the shape becomes fixed. Once that shape sets, your interest depends on whether it can still change. If it can, you stay. If it can't, you start to drift, not out of boredom, but out of recognition. You've probably noticed that you don't feel much attachment to labels for this reason. Labels are useful for orientation, but they don't define how you move. When a label stops helping you navigate, you set it down without much ceremony. This applies to roles as well. You don't mind responsibility, but you want to understand what the responsibility is actually doing. Does it open space? Does it close it? Does it lead somewhere new, or simply repeat what's already been decided? You tend to engage most fully when responsibility allows for interpretation rather than obedience. When you're trusted to make sense of a situation rather than just follow instructions, your attention sharpens. You become more present, not less. You've probably noticed that this makes you reliable in ways people don't always anticipate. When something genuinely matters to you, you stay with it. You don't flake. You don't lose interest easily. The stereotype of inconsistency disappears as soon as curiosity is properly engaged. What you don't stay with is obligation that has lost its meaning. Continuing something out of habit alone feels hollow. You prefer to move forward honestly, rather than remain loyal to something that no longer reflects reality. This honesty extends to how you handle mistakes. You don't dramatize them, but you don't dismiss them either. You look at what happened, note what it reveals, and adjust. The adjustment matters more to you than the apology. You've likely noticed that this makes you less defensive than most. Being wrong doesn't threaten your sense of self. Staying wrong does. Correction feels like progress rather than failure. You're also aware that your curiosity isn't indiscriminate. You don't chase novelty endlessly. You're selective about what deserves your attention. Something has to offer depth, perspective, or expansion to hold you. Empty stimulation fades quickly. This selectivity keeps your life moving in chapters rather than loops. Each phase has a focus. Each focus has a purpose. When that purpose has been served, you don't force yourself to stay longer than necessary. From the outside, this can look like a series of changes. From the inside, it feels continuous. Each shift makes sense, given what came before it. You've probably noticed that you don't feel particularly nostalgic about earlier versions of yourself. You remember them, but you don't cling to them. They were accurate at the time. Now something else is. This makes you less afraid of growth than people expect. Growth doesn't feel like abandoning who you were. It feels like carrying forward what still works and letting go of what doesn't. You're comfortable with that trade-off. You also tend to notice that you feel most alive when something is still unfolding. Not because you dislike stability, but because unfolding keeps you attentive. Once everything is decided, your role becomes smaller. While things are still in motion, you're fully engaged. That engagement doesn't require constant excitement. It requires movement, however subtle, a new angle, a better question, a shift in perspective that opens the view just enough to keep you interested. You're rarely chasing answers. You're following questions until they stop generating anything useful. When they do, you move on without regret. And so you continue in this way, letting curiosity guide your attention, letting flexibility support your commitments, and trusting that movement, when it's honest, will keep you oriented without needing to know exactly where it ends. Thank you for listening to the Sleepy Mind channel. I hope you have enjoyed spending time moving through the world of Sagittarius.